Welcome to this edition of Eyes on Books. I'm John Peters, and my co-host today is Susan Wheeler. Susan, why don't you give the audience a little summary about this spy thriller?
Oh, I'd be happy to, John. The Spy Coast is set in a small fictional town of Purity, Maine, where retired CIA agent Maggie Bird, who is in her 60s, is embracing a quiet life on a chicken farm, and the only intruder in her life is the occasional fox, and of course she carries a rifle for that. But when Maggie has an unexpected visit from a stranger, then discovers a body in her driveway, it's clear to her that her life is in danger, and Maggie realizes she can't completely hide from her past. So Maggie turns to the only people she can trust, and that is 4 of her quirky neighbors who, in Purity, Maine, like her, are also retired CIA agents. And with the help of the senior spies, she's drawn back into the deadly game of deception, betrayal, and unfinished business. This is the spy thriller with a fresh twist.
Well, Susan, that was a good summary for our audience. Finding that dead body in the driveway was a real game changer for me reading through this book. I didn't really expect that to happen because the dead person who wasn't dead, when she knocked on the door and tried to talk to Maggie, all of a sudden wound up dead. And that was really a change.
A total game changer. And that was when the whole book starts. That's when it begins, and you realize what is going to happen with this. You know, there's a woman in her 60s who is having people come after her in this sleepy little town. How is that going to work out? But interestingly enough, we soon discover this cast of characters that that share residency in this sleepy little town. What did you think about them?
Well, you know, birds of a feather flock together, I guess, is the only way we could describe that. It's interesting they were all in this little town in Maine.
I know.
Out of the way.
Yes. I wonder where that came up. I mean, how did she invent that? Or is it really real? Don't you wonder?
That's a good question to ask her during this interview. But it shows, I think, the camaraderie, and it shows that even though you're retired,
right, you're
still part of the brotherhood and sisterhood of the CIA.
You absolutely are.
So all the training they had that they thought they weren't going to use again came back, and they started to use it. And I thought what was really interesting was the police chief.
Oh my gosh, yes.
In this town. A female police chief who gets involved, and it's obvious that police chief thought, I've got this.
Absolutely, and they are so far ahead of her all the time. Well, we shouldn't be telling all this maybe, but anyway.
Well, light years. I mean, this is why you really need to get this book. This book was a real page turner.
It was.
And the way the author wove everything together, you just weren't quite sure where we were going next.
It's so true. And she brings in a lot of flashbacks where we learn about Maggie's life, where she's been, relationships. We learn about, it's tough to be a spy. It really is. How you lie to people and even making that transition into real life when you're used to living with lies. And then you are suddenly surrounded by real, honest, good people that you know you can trust. That's got to be a hard transition. But the other thing I enjoyed about the book was not these two, the spies and the non-spies, but how we learn about her past as a spy where she traveled around the world. And we learn about food from Thailand and being in Italy and different aspects of her life, which are very interesting.
Yeah, and I also thought all those years living a lie.
Yes.
I'm not a CIA person because if you admitted that, you'd get killed and it would blow your cover. Now they're in Purity, Maine, and they can't really tell the police chief in the beginning
Right.
who they are or what they're doing.
Exactly.
So it's like, I'm here, I'm Maggie, and then all of a sudden, no, maybe I'm not really Maggie after all. And all the other people come in, and it just overwhelmed the police chief, I think.
Well, it did. And you can see it gradually unfolding. You know, when she starts, the police chief starts really thinking about these other four people who are there. I mean, Maggie's the chicken farmer, and there's a man who vaguely says, oh, he used to work for the government, and another one whose home is filled with these very technical books on different things, who was a professor, and she starts thinking about who are these four people and what are their backgrounds.
Well, and that makes sense.
Of course.
I mean, it really does, because we're talking a real elevated, sophisticated plot here for a police chief in a small town.
Right.
It just doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't.
But the irony is the police chief thinks, and maybe even believes, I've got this.
She does.
And it just doesn't work. It just doesn't
really
work.
doesn't.
And that's another reason, quite frankly, you need to get this book and read it.
So true. So true. I like the balance between, well, a lot of things. You know, the flashbacks and the present, and also the balance between the different personalities. We really get to know these people, Maggie especially. They have their own persona. This is not like a typical James Bond spy thriller with lots of fancy gadgets and all of that. You get to know these people, what they're like in their real life, and how hard it must be to really be a spy. The never trusting and always having to live another life. And I love the cozy moments that they had. This group of, well, Maggie plus the four, they were cozy moments where they would get together, and they had a book group, right? The book group that they eventually called the Martini Club.
Right.
They would get together. One of them was a great chef, and he loved food. We learn a lot about food in this book.
Yes,
too.
we do.
And the Martini Club would get together and talk about what was going on in their daily lives in the small town. But then they're thrown into this other life that they can talk about in real time. Who is doing what and what's going on?
I think we learn more about them in this book, their personalities, their
I
background,
do too.
than if we met them in real life.
I think
Because
you're
they
right.
wouldn't expose that.
That's still true.
But it's exposed in this book.
It is.
I also found it interesting that the Martini Club, which back in the 50s and 60s and that time frame, people went home and had martinis. So everything is in sync. I mean,
Right.
the Martini Club for that age group seems to fit very well. And I thought she balanced that out and really mirrored the times as she wrote everything about these folks.
A very good point. Very good point. You know, this author, I'm going to talk with her, Tess Gerritsen, because she has written so many books. And my understanding is she had a medical background, but then switched gears. But her first books, I do remember, were of more of a grisly nature. I mean, they were real kind of hardcore forensic kind of books. And it'll be interesting to hear more about that. And she also was responsible for the Rizzoli and Ives series that eventually was on TV. I think it was a 6-part series that was very popular. But it's interesting how she could make that transition to what this book is about, the spy thriller.
And we'll ask her that during the interview for
Absolutely.
sure. I agree with you that this is not, if there is such a thing as a typical spy book.
No.
You know, it's not Mr. Gadget. You know, it's not all this,
No.
you know, secret microphones and, you know, things all over the place. This is real in the sense of this is basically an investigation
It is.
and how they go about finding evidence,
Exactly.
travel to get all this stuff put together,
Right.
because it all links back to a prior operation
Exactly.
that Maggie was involved with.
Right. Yeah.
And again, I think the author did a fabulous job of weaving all that together and at the same time holding your suspense.
And she does that very well. You know, it made me think back, well, in my early days as a librarian many decades ago, There were what do they call them? The lady sleuths, like Agatha Christie and Miss Marple series,
Right.
or Dorothy Gilman and Mrs. Polifax, who are these sweet old ladies who, in their 60s and 70s, and they call them the mystery cozies, these books, because they would track down all the evidence and all that, but in a very different way, certainly, than Tess Gerritsen does. But it was that sweetness and charm about them that I still get that feeling of in the Martini Club. They're together in this, and there's not a lot of blood and guts and evil, it's alluded to in this, but a same kind of feel to it.
Well, I think the Martini Club gave us, the reader, a real human view of these people.
It really did.
It's not a stereotype.
No,
over here.
no.
Oh, you're a spy.
Right.
No, the Martini Club put them in our world. A chef and all of the things that went on. They became real.
They did.
But then you have this contrast of this little town in Maine that's probably out in the middle of nowhere. You would never think stuff like this would happen.
Right.
And all of a sudden, their past comes roaring back. I mean, the suspense is, I think, at times overwhelming.
Well, it makes me think, is it time for more conversation to meet our author?
I think so. We'll meet the author in just a few seconds, and then we'll get the backstory of how this came about.
I can't wait.
Well, hello, Tess, and welcome to the Video Club of Laguna Woods, Eyes on Books.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. I'm John, and my co-host is Susan, and I'm going to kick it over to Susan for the first couple questions, and then we'll just go from there.
Okay. All right. Thanks, John. Oh, Tess, it's so nice to have you with us. Well, my first question is, now you were in medicine in your former life. Yes. And you have ended up writing these amazing books, being a best-selling author. Talk a little bit about that transition from medicine to writing spy thrillers.
Well, I started off as a medical doctor because my father told me that writing was no way to make a living. So I went to medical school, became a physician, and then I decided I was just going to keep on writing no matter whether I was paid for it or not. And after I went on maternity leave, I was finally given the chance to write a book because my little kids slept all the time. They were really good sleepers. And I published my first book in '87, and it's been almost 40 years now, and I'm working on my 33rd book.
Oh my gosh.
Wow, that is impressive. So Purity, Maine. I found the contrast of purity, meaning clean, interesting compared to a murder in a driveway.
Yes, it is. There is something disarming about a town that sounds like it's innocent, but of course no town is innocent. And I chose that name specifically because I wanted you to feel like this was a very special town. And it is, because it mirrors the town that I happen to live in, which is the town of Camden. 5,000 people live in this place, and we have a lot of influx of summer visitors. But we have an interesting history in our little town in that we are full of retired CIA people.
Really?
So I learned this when I first moved here almost 40 years ago, that I was surrounded by spies. And I wondered what it was like for them to be in a little town. They've had these interesting lives. And what do they do now? Do they just have cocktail parties? Do they talk about old times? Do they ever miss the days when they were living abroad doing interesting things? That was the genesis for The Spy Coast. It's about my hometown in a way, and it's also about people who are long retired but still have a very, very rich background and a lot of experience.
Well, that's interesting. I grew up in a small town of 800. And growing up in that small town, as I read your book, I could only imagine the banter that went on behind the scenes with this murder that took place, because in a small town, everybody knows everything about everybody. And you did a wonderful job of weaving the suspense with the characters and the people. It was just fascinating.
Well, I know what's fun for me is this conflict between these very sophisticated spies. It's a group of 5. They call themselves the Martini Club. And the local police officer, she's now the police chief. She's young. She's in her 30s. And she comes up against these people who she doesn't know very well, living in her town. And she doesn't understand why they're always a step ahead of her in this murder investigation. Who are they? So that contrast between the innocence of a Maine girl, a good, sturdy, honest Maine girl, and these 5 people who are used to living lives of deception, and watching them learn to trust each other and learn to appreciate each other's skills. That's what I really enjoy about this group.
What really struck me most, though, is the how we really got to know these people. Your Maggie Bird especially, how we know her as a really vulnerable person, a strong person, and we learn about how hard it must be to be a spy. And
that is one thing I picked up, and for my research, I read a lot of memoirs. I think memoirs, people, try to be honest about what their careers were like, and to live a life of deception where you cannot tell the truth, and sometimes not even to your own spouse. Right. That has to be really difficult. And to make a friend, maybe not a real friend, maybe this friend wants something out of you, maybe they're working for another government. I mean, that's got to wear you down. And it's nice for these 5 people to be able to rely on each other. Now, they trust each other. Maybe they shouldn't, but that's what makes them good friends, and that's what makes them a cohesive group that's ready and willing to help each other when they need it.
Absolutely.
What was the best part of writing the book? What did you enjoy the most?
As I said, the conflict between young and old, between innocence and sophistication. But I also enjoyed going to countries that I have been to myself and being able to describe them. For instance, Turkey. I've been to Istanbul multiple times. I've been to Bangkok. And also to bring in my love of food. Now, my father was a professional cook, so food was really important in our family. It's still important to me now. And I have found that people who've lived abroad, they have really open palates. They're ready to try everything, and they want to bring those foods into their kitchens. So that's how I see my spies, as being not just sophisticated in their work, but also in their food, in their booze. And you know what? Every spy drinks a lot. That's what I also found. So when you see them drinking their martinis, followed by wine, followed by, after dinner whiskey, that's probably pretty close to the truth.
Sure. Getting back to your beginnings in writing, what strikes me is the versatility that you have in writing in different genres. Some of your first books, well, you started by writing romances, is that right?
Yes. Over 40 years I've written, let me go through all the genres. I've written romance novels, medical thrillers, crime novels, historicals, science fiction, and now I'm writing spy novels. So it's I think it's partly because I get really bored sticking with one genre or sticking with one kind of a book.
Right.
And I just, for instance, that science fiction novel, it's the only one I've written, but I had so much fun with that.
Now, which one? Excuse me. Which one?
That's the book was Gravity.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt there, but you just have that high need for change, it sounds like.
Yes. I don't want to get bored as a writer, and I think it's really important for anybody who wants a long career in writing to be able to keep yourself interested, to write about things that you really want to know about. You can't just keep writing the same book over and over, because you'll lose your creative juices.
Sure, I can understand. Well, it seems like you're able to shift gears so easily, and the research that must be involved in. Well, when I look at some of the early works, the surgeon, for example, the great detail in that medical information, and it's like a forensic scientist that's there. Great detail, and then you move on to something else, doing more. Moving on to this. What about your research? Do you do a lot of traveling around the world still, or what does it take for as far as research for all your different novels?
It really depends on the novel itself. For instance, I mean, my most research-heavy book was probably Gravity, and that required me to go to NASA, go to Cape Canaveral, to really delve into the inner workings of NASA and the International Space Station. And that took me 2 years of research. For this particular book, The Spy Coast, I was drawing a lot on my own life because I have traveled a lot for fun. You know, I call myself a lifelong tourist because that's who I am. But every time I travel to a new place, I want to stay there for a while. You know, like I have sat in Istanbul for a couple of weeks and traveled throughout Turkey for probably a month. And those are things that you absorb. And when I sit back and start writing about it through memory, it suddenly feels like it's much more vivid in memory than it is when you're actually there. So if I can translate that to a story, and I can bring a reader to downtown Istanbul and taste some of the wonderful food there, I've done my job.
Oh.
You sound like the Louis L'Amour of international travel. Louis L'Amour, as you know, when he wrote it, it's 10 feet from here to that tree. He was actually there and measured it, which is kind of interesting because you went there and you had the experience. Now contrast that to Maggie Bird. How did you develop that character? Because you're not Maggie Bird.
No, what I was channeling was my inner retiree. I think that, especially as a woman, as we get older, we become invisible. Nobody pays attention to us anymore. Young people think, oh, boomer, what do they know? They're always putting us down. And I was channeling that part of her where she knows so much. She's so skillful. She's so wise. And yet she's ignored by younger people, ignored somewhat by Joe Thibodeau, the local police officer. And that makes her such a perfect spy. Because nobody pays attention to us. We can go in and out of places and nobody even notices us because of gray hair or just another gray-haired lady. There is no better spy than a retiree, I think.
No,
so I was channeling that. What is it like to have gone beyond what everybody thinks is your useful lifespan and still have a lot to give?
I think that's such a good point. And I'm remembering the old mystery cozies, they used to call them, with Miss Marple and Mrs. Polifax. Do you remember those?
Yeah.
And they very much, as you say, the little old gray-haired ladies are practically invisible, but they were the ones that solved the crimes every time because they could get away with it.
Well, in a prior life, I was in law enforcement. And to read about Joe Thibodeau, I immediately thought, here's somebody who's outgunned. I mean, thinks they know what's going on, and they are so far behind these folks. I found that an interesting part of the book, where you have this local police person who's really competing with CIA operatives, and they can't hold a candle to it. I thought that was fascinating.
And the great thing about Jo is that she is a smart woman. She's a very good cop, but you're right. She does not have the tools or the experience that these people have. And to watch her grow through the books. I mean, in the second book, she becomes much more aware of how she can use them. And she's aware of how useful they can be, even though their methods are not what she would use. Because Jo is such a law-abiding police officer. She goes by the book. She follows the rules. And let's face it, these 5 CIA people, the rules mean nothing to them. For them, it's all about just completing the mission, however you get there. So there's, again, that marvelous conflict between law-abiding and those who are willing to break the rules.
Right. I'd like to mention for our viewers that are not aware that Rizzoli and Isles, one of your most famous series that's been on TV for, 6 or 7 seasons. How was that, working with a TV crew? And did you do the script for it? Or how did that work out? Or even seeing your characters come to life? What an experience.
I admit I did not write any of the scripts. I think they only used one of my books for their pilot episode, and they used one of my short stories for one of the episodes, but they had their own team of writers. I had the best job of all. I was paid as a consultant, and I never had to do anything. But the fun part about it was seeing how they adapted it to television. Now, they made changes, which were a little startling to me at first.
I bet.
In the books, Jane Rizzoli is not a good-looking woman. She's utterly ordinary. In fact, she resents the fact that men don't even look at her because she's so ordinary-looking. And who did TV cast for that part? Angie Harmon, 6-foot-tall, beautiful model. So that was my introduction to how Hollywood does change things. They make it more glamorous. And then Maura Isles in the books, she's very much like a goth, dark figure. And in the TV show, she's played by this beautiful blonde named Sasha Alexander. So that's television. That's American television anyway.
Well, there must be an exciting experience, which leads me to what's in the future. Well, now this book was fabulous, and I hope there is a sequel or one that will be coming soon.
In fact, the sequel is coming out. I have it right in front of me.
All right.
There it is.
It's out in the U.S. March 18th. It's called The Summer Guest, and it's my same group of Martini Club people dealing with this time with the disappearance of a teenage girl who's come in to spend the summer with her family, and the number one suspect in this case is Maggie's next door neighbor. So she has to spring into action to prove that he's innocent. But there's another murder they discover when they drag the lake looking for this girl's body, and they find a skeleton that is totally unrelated. So now we have 2 murders, and it's fun to see Joe slowly realize that the Martini Club is again a step ahead of her. And then I'm working on the 3rd book. It's called The Shadow Friends. And it focuses more on the character Ingrid and her husband. And, when Ingrid was a spy, she worked with this very handsome man who became her lover. And now he's back in her life, and he's wreaking havoc on her marriage and, in a way, pulling her back into the spying game against the better wishes of everybody else.
Well, Tess, this has been a fascinating interview, and we have learned so much about this book, are excited about the new book that is out now, and one after.
I hope everybody enjoys it.
Thank you, Tess.
I'm sure they will. Thank you so much. We appreciate your taking time to watch Eyes on Books. We look forward to the next edition. We hope you will come back and watch Eyes on Books here in Laguna Woods.